Our guest this evening is John Judis, and he is often described as one of America's best political journalists. Mr. Judis is the author of The Populist Explosion: How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics. This book is the basis for our discussion and should provide the historical and political clarity needed for us to understand what is happening here and in Europe. John, in trying to comprehend the appeal of the Trump presidency, more often than not, you hear the word populist being used. So it seems to me the mega question is, what is populism?
First of all, people get confused because they think of political terms like scientific terms, as if you're talking about gravity or some chemical compound. But political terms like liberal, conservative, populist don't have specific definitions. There's no exclusive set of characteristics that will tell you what is or isn't a populist. Putin has been described as a populist. Reagan, Jack Kemp was described as a populist. A lot of times it's used as a synonym for popular. Europe for demagogue. So what I'm talking about in the book, and I think a useful way of understanding it because it helps explain our politics today, is a political tradition that starts in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s, and that's where the word itself comes from, migrates to Europe sometime in the 1970s and 1980s, and becomes a major factor in European politics in the 1990s or so. The distinguishing characteristic of this tradition is a conflict between the people and an elite, people and the establishment. It's not, there isn't any specific group at any specific time that has to be defined as the people or as the elite. Sometimes the people are the poor, sometimes they're the struggling middle class, sometimes the elite are Wall Street, the money power, sometimes they're the treacherous Democrats in Washington, sometimes they're just Washington itself. It's a two-pronged relationship between the people and the elite. Okay, so let's get that. Now I want to introduce something to confuse matters a little, which is that there are left-wing and right-wing varieties of populism. Left-wing unites the middle and the bottom of society against the top. But the classic example currently would be Occupy Wall Street, 99% versus the 1%. Bernie Sanders against the billionaire class. In American history, the People's Party of the 1890s. Huey Long would be another example of left-wing populism. In Europe, Podemos, the Spanish group, is an example of populism in this sense. Then there's what you might call a right-wing or conservative variety. That also sees a conflict between the people and the elite. For instance, Donald Trump attacks corporation heads who want to move their firms to Mexico and leave workers in the lurch. Right? But they also, in addition to seeing a conflict between the people and the elite, they have a third term that enters the equation. And that is the idea that the elite or establishment is coddling another group. Muslims, African Americans, illegal immigrants, asylum seekers, you name it. It's an other group. So with right-wing populism, you have this third element entering the picture. Left-wing populism, it's just middle and bottom versus the top. Now I want to say just one more thing, and I hope this doesn't confuse you, which is that though I call them left-wing and right-wing, there is something misleading about that too, because the right-wing populists are not really in many respects right-wing. Donald Trump, for instance, campaigned on a promise to protect Medicare and Social Security. His trade policies are the same pretty much as Bernie Sanders. attacking runaway shops, corporations that leave the United States in order to find cheaper wages elsewhere. In Europe, the National Front, Marine Le Pen, its platform is somewhat, I'd say, to the left of the Democratic Party. It's way to the left of Hillary Clinton, and it's slightly to the left of Bernie Sanders on domestic issues, capping credit card charges, separating investment banking from commercial banking, Glass-Steagall. That's a part of their platform. Making sure that their version of national health insurance applies to all people regardless of income or locale. In other words, though I describe these as right and left, they're peculiar in other respects. They're kind of hybrids, these right-wing populist parties. And I guess the final thing I'm going to say is that their peculiarity is what distinguishes them. You know, people said about Trump, well, he's not a normal Republican. He's not a normal Republican, and he's certainly not a Democrat either. In Europe, it's very, you know, they call Marine Le Pen, they call the Danish party the extreme right. And we can talk about the way the terms are used in Europe, but they're not really the extreme right in the way that we in America would think about it. They arise at certain times when the common political vocabulary, the assumptions by which people understand politics, are starting to break down. And when it's possible to build a movement on the basis of the fact that the leadership of the major parties is clueless. They don't understand what's really happening. They don't understand the problem of illegal immigration. They don't understand the corporations moving overseas, et cetera, et cetera. So again, populist parties, left, right, but mainly peculiar, erupting at certain times. They're an early warning sign that the consensus that is held together, politics in the United States or in Western Europe, is starting to break down. So that's my 2 bits.
Well, how is it different from other politics then? I mean, with people raising their concerns and...
Sure. Yeah. The difference between populist politics, as you know, take again the Sanders and Trump as an example, and let's say standard issue liberalism in America. Liberalism goes back really in a lot of ways to Teddy Roosevelt and then to Franklin Roosevelt. The basic idea being to pluralism, to reconcile interests, but with a view towards acknowledging and taking account of the working class, the middle class, and the poor, not leaving them in the lurch. But it's not a politics that, for instance, differentiates the people from the business class or Wall Street. It doesn't make that same kind of difference. That's really the difference between, let's say, a Hillary Clinton and a Bernie Sanders. Republican conservatives, many of them you could take the Chamber of Commerce, see the interests of society from the standpoint of business, and see that everything is, in that respect, what's good for business is what's good for the country. They more or less look down from a standpoint of business. Again, that's different. They don't make the same dichotomy. They don't see the same kind of conflict as populists do. So that's basically what distinguishes populism from the other kinds of politics.
What, do you think we're too quick to define them? I mean, and label them like they're the other? How would they define themselves? Or does it really even matter?
Well, look, in the United States, people, the term is sometimes debated about, but you know, since the 1880s or 1890s, people have not been embarrassed about describing themselves as populists, either on the left or the right. And there's a lot of groups. I mean, Bernie Sanders wouldn't object to the definition. And Trump, Stephen Bannon, populist, economic nationalist. Europe is different. In Europe, it's a bad word.
So what is the difference? Besides being
The difference is that they really haven't, until very recently, had a left-wing populist tradition.
That's more in the South.
Yes,
Spain,
yes,
Greece.
it's almost entirely in the South. You know, they had social democrats, Christian Democrats, Labor Party, conservative, Tories, but they didn't have a left-wing populism. They just had a right-wing populism. So right-wing populism becomes itself an outgroup in politics. It's seen as the extreme right. Like in Podemos, the Spanish party, there has been a long debate about even whether they should, use that word. Syriza in Greece, again, reluctant to describe themselves that way, but it is becoming more common in Europe. It's still, though, it's a no-no. You don't.
Right, but there's often a commingling of the terms fascist and right-wing populist. So how would you distinguish them, and is that dangerous, I would assume, to label them or commingle those terms together?
There are similarities between the fascism of the 20s and 30s and...
But what is the difference now? I mean, they're really not the same.
Fascist movements arise particularly we'll talk about Italy and Germany, in the wake of the Russian Revolution. Their primary purpose is to knock out the socialists and the communists. That's the context in which they begin. And that's really how they end up getting business support. Not within a democratic tradition. Not parties that aimed their complaint was that the society wasn't democratic enough. Always within a basic authoritarian political context. That's different, again, from the parties in the United States and in Europe. The second thing that I would emphasize is that the fascist parties of the 20s and 30s were still within this struggle for empire that begins in the West, in the 19th century, and particularly after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. And what they sought to do was to build and become imperial powers, to challenge Britain, to challenge the United States. Mussolini wanted to create the Roman Empire. Hitler wanted Third Reich. Right-wing populist parties today, and this also is true of I would say too, of the left, are almost, you could say, contractionary. Trump doesn't want to take over Mexico. He wants to keep Mexicans out of the United States. The National Front in France wants to leave the European Union. In other words, they're not, what they are is in some sense a reaction to the internationalization of politics, diplomacy, and economics that occurs after World War II. WTO, IMF, in Europe, in particular, the European Union and the Euro. So historically, it's a completely different rhythm. Now, I'm not saying that makes them good. We may face some real dangers in the United States, but it's not the same as 1920s and 1930s, and screaming about Hitler and stuff is not going to help us understand better, and it's especially not going to help us understand the people who were attracted, let's say, the Trump voters. So,
do you think it's just a movement, or is it something more, bigger than that will have legs and continue?
Well, a movement is something big. I guess the question is, did Trump just get elected here, and does he, in addition to that, represent an electorate that will stick with him regardless? And we don't know that yet. What I'd say, I guess, is that there is a core group that is not that large. Maybe it's 20% of the electorate, of the voting electorate too, that goes through American politics, let's say starting with George Wallace in 1968, 1972. More male than female. At that time, graduated from high school but didn't go any farther. At that time, too, blue collar, but now not so. Now have gone to college but maybe didn't get a degree, or went to Salisbury State rather than the University of Maryland. Primarily white and primarily older rather than younger. Not that no young people. Now, this body of the electorate, there's a sociologist named Donald Warren who did these studies in 1971 and 1976, and he wrote a book called The Radical Center, and he found that this group was central to Wallace's candidacy. And the way they see the world is they see themselves as besieged on the top and the bottom by an elite or a ruling class that is oblivious to their needs, and an elite that is making them, in effect, pay for the welfare given to the people below. You know, in the 68, 72, it's primarily blacks, and then it changes as the decades go on. So this group moves through the society and the electorate like a big rodent, you could say, would move through a python. If you imagine swallowing, you can see it going through. And at one time, it's concerned about taxes, the tax revolt, late 70s. Another time, religion, Christian coalition. It helps Buchanan and Perot. A lot of them vote for them in the 1990s. War on terror, anti-Islam in the early 2000s, and you know, lo and behold, now Tea Party and Trump. I think that's the group that that is the most fervent in its support of Trump. It's not again a strictly right-wing group. It's not. These are people who objected to Obamacare because they felt that it was forcing up their premiums in order to pay for the uninsured. But they want Medicare and Social Security. And if Trump is stupid enough to go along with Paul Ryan and the Republican leadership, then he'll be in a lot of trouble, because this group actually is liberal on those kind of issues. Just as Wallace's voters were New Deal liberals. They were just also racist. So, you know, segregationists.
Well, no, you emphasize a lot of the economics of it, but isn't there cultural factors that play into it, or where these voters are located?
Yes, that's what I was saying. That
right.
As this group moves through, it takes different forms. Sometimes the issue is primarily cultural, sometimes it's economic. But the different aspects of it coexist. I used to do a lot of writing about the conservative movement. I wrote my first book, was a biography of Bill Buckley. And I used to go to the Christian Coalition meetings in the 90s and interview people. And I remember in 1992, the leadership of the Christian Coalition was Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed. Reed had gotten his start at the Young Republicans. He was basically an operative and remains that, not a deeply religious guy in that sense. Robertson, again, son of a senator, big businessman. So they were more or less identified with the standard Republican leadership. And when it came to NAFTA in 1992 and 1993, free trade, they were all for it, because, you know, it was going to help business. And they got the organization to endorse it. But I would interview people, the rank and file, and even the people who went to the convention. They say, no, we're totally against that stuff. You know, we like Pat Buchanan. So I guess what I'm saying is that kind of sensibility continues and it coexists. Obviously, there's a lot of intolerance toward Mexican Americans that you find in the Trump voters. But it coexists with a feeling that we have to rein in these corporations that keep moving overseas. We have to do something about they're avoiding taxes, all these other issues. To do something about jobs. Jobs was the key issue. Make America great again. Make it so that we make things and we don't have to buy stuff from China or Japan if we want to get a TV or what have you. So I guess what I'm saying, in the wake of the Great Recession, the economic aspects have come to the surface and the cultural ones remain. And they always remain like that, but it's pushed economics to the forefront.
And that's what ties actually Europe and the U.S. together in some ways, because they both suffered from financial crisis in some way.
Yes, correct.
Right. So let me ask, if Donald Trump was not the celebrity that he was because of The Apprentice, do you still think there would have been someone like, well, there was Bernie Sanders for the Democrats, but in the Republican Party, was there somebody waiting in the wings?
Somebody, I mean, it was odd, and I saw Trump in August of 2015 in New Hampshire, and I went there. I dragged my wife. We go there for vacation every summer. There was line hundreds of yards of people lined up to see this guy. And I, had no idea that this was happening. There is no comparable Republican. It is a kind of odd thing. Look, what I'd say is that if you compare let's say, Ross Perot in 1992 with Donald Trump. Ross Perot was actually ahead in the polls in May of 1992. He was ahead of both George H.W. Bush and of Bill Clinton. And, you know, by significant margin, not beyond the margin of error. And it looked like he might actually be president. But it turned out that he was very prickly. And not prickly in a way that Donald Trump was either. I mean, he really, the whole meet the press kind of thing just threw him for a loop. He ended up dropping out, if you remember, in July of 1992, and then he came back, but it was too late. But his candidacy and the issues that he was raising were viable then. Somebody, and Bill Clinton takes over a lot of them. People before profits becomes Clinton's slogan in July, and that's directly in response to Ross Perot. Trump, I think, again, because of his experience in television,
right. And social media and the Twittering.
Has been able to surmount all these things. I mean, you know, you think about that video would have just doomed any usual politician. So there's no doubt that he has exceptional political skills, and that's a reason that he got beyond you know, his adversaries in the Republican Party. When I listened to him, he had that ability of television people to appear as if he was improvising what he said. But in fact, his speeches were all like, you know, those old French novels where you could shuffle them. He always said the same thing, but it seemed like he was saying it anew to that audience.
Well, he involved the audience too, which I think he made it a part of it.
Is polling dead? The economic data have never been as benign. The unemployment rate's down to 5.5. Obama had unprecedented approval ratings. All of these numbers, you know, suggested that this thing was in the bag for Clinton. All of the pundits, you know, were utterly, blithely unaware of what was going on in the middle of the country. And I'm thinking to myself, the pollsters are useless. The polling numbers were very encouraging for her. Do you think, as an industry, it's shot, given their track record with the election?
Well, this is definitely not my area of expertise in judging these polls. I mean, there are people now who make a whole living of, you know, saying which polls are better than the others. I want to answer your question in a different way, which is that one of the reigning assumptions of people who thought that Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in was that the country was in good shape. And usually you find if unemployment is, you know, 4.5%, and if things are getting better, you think of 1984 with Ronald Reagan, where it was, what, about 7 or 8%, but it had been 12. You know, the party that has been in power is going to do well. But the economics in the United States are kind of tricky now. They're not the same as they were in 1980. Katz and Kruger. Kruger was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors for Obama. Published this study that just came out of what kind of jobs were created during the recovery from the recession. And lo and behold, a large number, I can't remember the percentage, but it would surprise you. I think it was a majority are of this kind of temporary, Schedule C, contractual, and part-time jobs. So again, the employment figures can be misleading. The other thing that struck me about the election was that if you looked at a map of where manufacturing jobs have disappeared since 2000, you would see an almost exact match between the Trump success in swing states, and in the South too, incidentally. The two leading states in terms of losing manufacturing jobs, one was Michigan, but what was the other one? North Carolina, furniture industry. Trump wins.
Can you talk to us about how the Great Recession, 2008, collapse of the banks and the collapse of the real estate market, how did that transform American politics? I know it ended up with the election of Donald Trump, but how did it transform? How did 2008 transform American politics?
What I'd say is that if you look at the last 40 or 50 years, After 1970s, early 1980s, you get a change in American politics. Really, that's the Reagan years. You get the promise of a new kind of economy. People, remember Clinton talked about the new economy. Globalization used to be something good. When the promise of a new politics, of a new political economy seems to fail, you get a reaction. The first big burst of populism is in 1992, and it comes exactly in the wake of the first of that first post-Reagan recession. 1996, we get the internet boom, and everything just goes away. I mean, Perot and Buchanan basically become irrelevant. 2001, we get the internet problems, but at the same time, we get 9/11. So everybody's focused on the war on terror and the threat of terrorist attacks, and then on the war in Iraq. When the recession hits, again, it surfaces this idea that somehow the promise of all this, of globalization, all these things is not delivered. So economics come to the surface. And you get a group that has already been discontented about various things becoming focused more on economics, though still, again, aggrieved in terms of culture and other issues. So that would be my simple explanation.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.